Today is Friday, the 9th of February 2024. My name is Crispin Brooks. I'm interviewing John Haidu on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation. The interview is taking place in London, England, the United Kingdom, and the language of the interview will be English. Please state your name.
My name is John Haidu.
And what was your name at birth?
The name was Haidu, but the first name was János, which is Hungarian equivalent of John. Haidu is a very popular Hungarian name, which of course wasn't the original name of the family. My grandfather decided to change the name from Herzog, thinking that it'll make a difference, which of course it didn't.
And did you have any other names?
No.
And any nicknames growing up?
No.
And is there any special significance to your first name? Were you named after anyone in the family? Or?
No, János is a very popular Hungarian name, like Haidu is a very popular Hungarian name. In fact, if you go to Hungary today, every village in a certain part of Hungary is called Haidu something or another, and it's a very traditional peasant name.
And please tell us, when were you born?
I was born in April 1937 into a well-to-do middle-class Jewish family. I have no brothers or sisters. My grandfather and my father were both directors of an insurance company, and my mother was a bookkeeper. We had no money worries. We lived in a part of Budapest which was predominantly Jewish. We went to the cinema, to the theaters. We had a nice social life. We had no problems of any kind. Budapest was a place where lots of Jews lived. Hungary had 400,000 Jews, out of which 23% lived in Budapest, so a very large percentage.
And can you tell me a little bit, first of all, your parents' names?
Yes, my mother was Livia, and my father was George or George.
And what do you know about your family history going back a generation or two?
I spent a lot of time looking at family history, and in fact I have managed to figure out a family tree which has got bigger and bigger and bigger as I went along, but it's very small as far as my own family is concerned. My mother was one of three. She has a brother called Rudy and a sister called Ibi, and those names will come up later in our conversation. My father was a single man. He had no brothers or sisters.
And does your your forebears, do they go back, are they all Budapest based, or are they from other places?
They were based in the country. I won't go into that, but as I was researching the family history, I was able to go back to 1830-ish by going to cemeteries and looking at records. They came from different parts of Hungary, really.
And which parts in particular?
I can't remember that, but it's really irrelevant. They're a little village somewhere.
And what is your earliest memory?
Well, I can remember very little of my first few years, and it's very difficult. I'm often asked this question when I give talks on what I remember. And really, I remember very little until I was about 3 or 4 years old, when all the problems have started in Hungary.
In terms of, possibly before you can remember, but perhaps what you've been told in your early years,
Yep.
and just to learn a bit about your family's life in Budapest before the war. Where did you live?
We lived in, as I said, in an area which was predominantly Jewish, called Hollán utca, which was just off the main boulevard, very near the Danube. It was very convenient, very happy, and in fact later on I went to a Jewish school just across the street from me, and I had a very happy time there, but that was when I was 6 years old, so it's 2 or 3 years later.
And what do you have any sort of memories of the actual building and place where you live?
Yes, I later on, I went back to Budapest, first alone, and then with my family. And because I wanted to show them where I was born and where I've lived, and we did, in fact, go into both the block of flats where I was living as a very young boy, and another block of flats where I lived later on. We went to the synagogue, and I managed to show them the school where I was and the school where I later studied.
When you went back, was there anyone there that you still knew? Or?
No, there was nobody from my early years. There were students whom I was in school with later on, but that was after I've been to a technical college when I was 16, 17 years old. So looking at my early years, I have very little memory, and I have no friends or relatives on that period apart from my immediate relatives and cousins.
And did you say you lived in like a house or a flat? Or?
It was a block of flats, and we lived on the third floor.
And if you can sort of take me back into that world, if you were showing me where you lived at that time, what would I see? What would it look like?
You would see a very happy family, nice, heavy, old-style furniture, old style. Everything was old style. We lived in a almost not Victorian, but an old-style old-style Jewish family. And of course, what I vaguely remember, that my parents went to the synagogue. But we didn't live an Orthodox Jewish life. It was a very liberal, free life.
Was it a neolog?
Yes, exactly that.
And when you say an old Jewish style, what would that have meant?
Traditional, if you like. It's very difficult to describe. The food was traditional. The way we lived was traditional. Meeting friends and relatives in the Jewish circle was traditional.
And you mentioned the food. What kind of things can you remember from those early years?
Well, it's very difficult because obviously it was the kind of soups and pancakes and things like that. But that stayed with me all along as a traditional Hungarian way of eating and living.
And when you, in this, period, I guess between, up to about age 7 or up to 6.5, that kind of age, do you remember any particular hobbies or interests?
No, none at all. Oh, well, yes, I went skating. Skating was very popular, but I was still very small at that time. But throughout my youth, even after the Russians came in, we did go skating, and we did go swimming, and we did go to play table tennis. But that's a little later on in life.
And where did the skating happen?
Well, there were two places. One was in the behind Hero Square. There's a lake which was artificially made into an ice rink every winter. That was very popular. But also locally, some squares and some playgrounds were made into ice rinks when there was a lot of snow and ice in Hungary.
And can you tell me a bit about what your parents did for a living or during?
Well, as I mentioned, my mother was a bookkeeper, and my father was a director of an insurance company. Because my grandfather was in the insurance business, and they were very happy. There was no problem to start with. It's only later on that life has become difficult. Like 1939, I remember 1939 when really the government started to squeeze the Jews, when they have decided to bring in anti-Jewish laws in 1939 and then later in 1941. And that is when life for the Jews have started to become difficult.
Just before we get there, I wanted to ask a couple more questions about life before, or we'll come to the changes shortly. In terms of, do you happen to know the name of the insurance company that your grandfather and father worked?
I have been given, through very strange ways, 2 cigarette cases. One which was owned by my grandfather and one which was owned by my father, which I still have. And I The name of the insurance companies are there, but I can't remember offhand. I can show it to you later on.
That would be great. And your mother worked separately as a bookkeeper?
Completely separately. She didn't need to work, but she decided that she wanted to be independent as possible, and she lived and she did work as a bookkeeper.
So if both your parents were at work, who looked after you?
I have no idea. Oh yes, we did have somebody living in who helped us, because the flat was big enough. There was a room on the side which was used by this lady who looked after me.
And what do you remember of her?
Absolutely nothing, except that she was almost part of the family. She wasn't an au pair or a maid. She was much more than that. She was almost part of the family, and I remember that it was a very happy relationship.
Do you know if she was Jewish or not?
I'm sure she was not.
Any thoughts about where your parents found her or hired her from?
Absolutely none. I remember I was 3 or 4 years old. I remember very little about what happened.
And did you keep a kosher home at that time?
Absolutely not. It was definitely not a kosher household. We ate all kinds of food, meat or whatever. There was never a problem.
At that time, in those years, before and during the early years of the war, were you able to meet with grandparents and aunts and uncles?
We must have met. Certainly my grandfather, I remember meeting. My grandmother died reasonably early. The other grandparents, I don't remember at all.
And which was the grandfather you do remember?
The one whose name was Haidu, not the other side, which was the Farago, which my mother's side.
And so your paternal.
Yes, exactly.
And what do you remember of him?
Only that he was a lovely man. Looking at his photo, there's always a permanent smile on his face, and I shall never forget that. And
can you talk a little bit? You mentioned that your parents sometimes went to a Neolog synagogue?
Yes, a local synagogue.
And did they take you?
No.
And at home, what kind of observances or holidays might have been celebrated?
Absolutely none. As far as I can remember, there were no celebrations or any kind. We may have had candles on Fridays, but I don't remember.
Birthdays at all? Do you remember?
No. My memories really don't go back further than when I was 4 or 5 years old.
And another thing you mentioned, maybe when you were around 6, you went to school.
Yes, the school was a general Jewish school, as I said, opposite the block of flats where we lived. In fact, I could see it from the window of our flat. It was about 30 of us taught by Jewish teachers, but a very broad-minded school, general subjects, and it was a very happy time.
30 for the whole school or just in your class?
I only remember my class, but the core school was a Jewish school.
And in terms of your parents and the world that they lived in pre-war Budapest, what do you know of who they socialized with? Did they mainly socialize within the Jewish community or more broadly?
I think mainly Jewish community. They, as far as I remember, all the friends and relatives obviously were Jewish. I don't remember meeting non-Jewish or remembering meeting any non-Jewish families at all. As I said, it was a large community. 23% of the population of Budapest was Jewish. So you can imagine that having lived in that area, we mixed mainly with Jewish people.
And do you remember any friends of your own from that time?
No, I remember only people from much later.
And any sense of your parents' politics growing up, whether there was a particular party or movement they preferred or didn't like? Or
no, I mean, I was much too young to understand politics at that time. I just know that we lived a happy life. We had a nice family life, and I don't know of any political background of any kind.
Was there any interest in Zionism in the
No.
family? And when did you, from what you know and what you remember, when did you start to sort of sense things changing, and what was?
From what I was told, changes started in 1939 when the government decided to restrict the movements of the Jews. And what that meant that my father and my grandfather will have to consider their whole future, because life for Jews have then started to become difficult. And starting in 1939, when the Hungarian government was allied to the German government, the Nazi German government, which then escalated by 1941 to such an extent that by that time we have been restricted to, for example, my father couldn't run a Jewish company, so he had to resign. He couldn't work as a director, so has my grandfather. We, by that time, could not go to cinemas or restaurants. We were not allowed to go on buses or trams. We were not allowed to go to parks. So that's when, in 2 years, everything escalated to such an extent that life has become very hard.
And from your own memories, do you remember specific sort of incidents of not being able to, or restrictions, or that sense?
Not until 1943, I think, which is when I start remembering things. But I know, again, from what I was told, that Hungarian Jews were by then not allowed to become teachers or solicitors. They were not allowed to go and get involved in any companies. So I know by now that this is what's happened when I was only 4 or 5 years old. And in fact, I also know that it was difficult for Hungarian Jews to go to universities because there was a quota system. Only very few Hungarian Jewish students were allowed to go to universities. And I also know that Jews couldn't marry non-Jews. So that all happened, escalated between 39 and 43.
Were your parents both able to remain working through this time?
No, by that time, my father had to give up work, and my mother had to give up also being a bookkeeper. And of course, as we know, by that time, all the restrictions were in place, and they had no chance of doing anything else but look after me.
Do you have any idea how they managed without income?
Well, by that time, because they had family income, they were able to live on the income, on the capital, if you like, but then neither of them earned any money by then.
And how about your grandfather at this time?
He also had to stop work.
Did you have any contact with non-Jews, with like non-Jewish Hungarians, and have a sense of their reaction to things?
No, at that time, again, being so small, I was protected, if you like, from what's going on around me, and shielded, if you like. So I knew very little of what was going on.
And the nanny or the governess that you had, was she still with you at this time? Or
No, she has left. We were left completely on our own.
And before the Germans invaded, before March 1944, were there any other events in terms of family members?
Indeed, there was a major event in 1943 when forced labor camps were established in Hungary. And my father was taken to such a camp, and it was about an hour or so away by train. And my mother and I had to visit my father with some food, which we had to take with us. I remember that he told us that many became ill and many died. They were forced to build fortifications, roads and railway. They had a very bad life. And what that meant, that from that moment on, my mother had to look after me on her own, and indeed our flat on her own. And we didn't see my father for quite some time after that.
And do you know the name of this place where he was?
No, I tried to discover the name of the place. There were several in Hungary, but I have never been able to discover. I have a map of all the camps and labor camps, if you like, but I don't know which one my father was in.
And do you have you retained any sort of visual memory of what the camp looked like when you visited?
No, I just remember that it was guarded and we had to get permission to go in, and it was not a nice life, I can tell you that.
But you were allowed in to see him?
Yes, exactly.
And do you know what time of year it would have been? Was it the weather, roughly?
No, I can't remember that.
And did the same thing happen to your grandfather as well? Do you know? Or was he?
No, he was too old, and at that time they left him alone. And of course, the next step was in March 1944, when we were asked to move into a Yellow Star house. And that meant that we had to leave our home.
Before we get there, do you have any memory of the actual arrival of the Germans and the change in power in Hungary?
No, not at that stage. Only because my father was in a camp, I realized that I'm not seeing my father next to me, and it was very strange because I didn't know where he was until my mother explained and then visited him. So that was the first time that I felt that something is wrong.
Right.
That something is not right, that I'm being restricted from living my normal life. And I was only 6 years old.
Of course. But when the Germans arrived in spring 44,
yeah,
do you have any sort of memories of what that looked like?
Yes, that was when, as I just mentioned, I was told by my mother that we have to move, leave our flat, and go into a so-called Yellow Star house. Now, that meant a total upheaval. It meant to give up everything and go and live somewhere else. As it happened, the Yellow Star house, a block of flats, was where my cousin lived. And by that time, they fortunately moved out of the country because they, for some reason, had a way of getting out special permits. So they escaped all this. But the flat was empty, and we were able to move into that flat with my grandfather and my aunt. So we were in that flat for some time, and I know that we were allowed to go out of that block of flats, which had a yellow star on the front entrance, the front gate. We were allowed to go out of that block of flats only in the afternoon for a couple of hours, which was spent in queuing for food. And what I didn't say, that by that time we had to wear a yellow star on our clothing, which of course meant that when we went out of the block, we were abused and shouted at, and some were beaten. These 2 hours were spent on queuing for food, but strangely enough, we were not allowed to buy such items as butter and rice. We only are allowed to buy basic items of food. And the other point is that in this Yellow Star house, there was no medical help available. So if you were ill or you had a problem, it's bad luck, nothing you could do. And in fact, this reminds me that my grandfather, on my father's side, was ill with cancer. And in fact, he died in that house, in that block of flats, while we were there, and we couldn't even attend her funeral. This is something just now I remember, which I don't normally talk about. So there we were in this block of flats, and we go out now and again to get some food. And the next step was when the Nazi Party, which was allied to the Hungarian fascist government, and obviously allied to Germany, went from block to block to start getting together the women and children, which was the next step, having already accomplished the getting the men either into labor camps or into concentration camps or killing them. The next step was to get the mother and children to collect them as soon as possible and to get them into concentration camps. And when was that? I was 7 years old. And I remember that the police or whoever they were came to our block, and they started going from the 5th floor. We were on the 3rd floor. And my aunt, who was with us, as I mentioned, said, "This is not going to be very good." And at that time, my mother was already downstairs, was taken downstairs to the corridors, down to the courtyard to be taken away. My aunt said, "No, I'm not having this." She grabbed me and took me across the corridor to a non-Jewish friend who she begged to hide us in his flat in a cupboard. So what happened was that he agreed to hide her and me in his cupboard. If we would have been discovered, not only were us in trouble, not only would have been shot, but he would have been shot as well. So miraculously, we survived in this cupboard, in this dark cupboard, which I remember with dread, while my mother was taken away to a concentration camp.
And how long would you have been in that cupboard for?
This is a question I'm often asked, and it's very difficult. All I know is that it seemed like a long time. Whether it was 20 minutes, half an hour, or an hour, I have no idea. All I know is that I was told not to move or not to say anything because it was not clear whether that flat was at any one time searched. As it happens, because the man was not Jewish, his flat was not searched. And so we survived, which was an absolute miracle.
Did you hear things happening outside, or was it silent?
No, nothing, because it was a very big cupboard, a very old style wooden cupboard, and both my aunt and I being in there, we heard nothing, fortunately. So what happened next is that...
Oh, John, sorry to interrupt.
No.
Just before we...
Of course.
Do you happen to know the name of this neighbour?
No, it's very sad that... I mean, he's a righteous Christian, effectively. He's one who saved 2 Jewish lives. And by the time I went back, the man wasn't living there anymore. And my aunt did not tell me or could not remember the name. This is one of the things I'm very sad about. I would have very much liked to go back and thank him for saving our lives, but unfortunately I never had a chance.
And do you remember the street name of the Yellow Star House and where this happened?
Yes, that was called Wartsjood, which was about 15-20 minutes walk from where we lived. By the way, it's worth mentioning that when we moved into the Yellow Star House from our home, which is, I say, is about 20 minutes, it was at night. Because if we would have done it at daytime, we could have easily been killed by the Nazi party, the Arrow Cross party, because they were hunting all Jews on the street, and especially those with a yellow star on their clothing. So we had to be very careful moving from door to door, block to block, before we arrived at the Yellow Star House.
And what was your aunt's name who you were with at this time?
His name was Ibi, or Iboya in Hungarian, but we always called her Ibi. Ibi Farago, which was the name of my mother's maiden name.
And you mentioned, just before we move on, the other people, the house, the Yellow Star House that you moved to, before it was a Yellow Star House, your cousin
lived there.
What were their names, that family?
They were called Korda, Korda. That was her husband's name. And they had a very happy life, and so that was her parents' name, because she wasn't married then yet.
Got it, and I apologize for interrupting.
No, not at all. It's interesting because there's so many bits and pieces in my life which I find very difficult to put in context, and sometimes I forget names or dates.
Of course, naturally. One more thing, you mentioned about your grandfather dying while you were in the Yellow Star House. Was there and obviously he was unable to get medical treatment. Was there any kind of funeral or anything like that, burial that
No,
happened?
he was taken away. We were not allowed to go. We had to stay in the Yellow Star House. They knew that he died. They took him away. I have no idea what happened. We had no way of remembering her other than within ourselves. There were not ceremonies, but there were no way of doing anything about it, really.
And having been rescued from the roundup, what happened next?
Well, next, of course, from the Yellow Star House, Ibi and I had to move somewhere. We couldn't stay where we are. So she found an abandoned flat somewhere where we moved in temporarily because it was only a step before the next step, which is moving into the ghetto. But we moved out of the Yellow Star House because we had nowhere to stay there. And within a few weeks, we had no choice but to move into the ghetto. Now, the ghetto was an area behind the synagogue, which was for Jews only. All non-Jews have been moved out. And it was guarded by the army. And there were 290 buildings with 20 of us in each flat in each block. And we had no medical help. We had no food apart from water brought up from the street and bread and drippings and so on. And I'm told that every day about 80 people died on the streets from malnutrition, from illness, which could be any kind of tuberculosis, anything like that. And so we lived in this flat. I can't remember more than that we were in 20 of us squeezed together in this flat in a very strange way, with not really able to live a proper life.
Did you know any, other than your aunt, did you know any of the other people that you were squeezed into the flat
No,
with?
they were all strangers.
Any other children there?
Yes, there were some children, a bit older than I was. I was probably the youngest in the flat.
Do you remember like playing with them or having any interaction?
No, we didn't stay there more than a few weeks, I know that. But no, we didn't. I don't think there was such a thing as playing because there's no toys of any kind, really.
And within the ghetto, what street would this have been? Do you know?
Yes, I went back and took a photo of the block of flats where we stayed. It's called Veseleni Utsa, which was a street very near the synagogue. And it looks different now, obviously, but I remember now where I was, and I'm very glad that I was able to go back and take a photo of it.
And the ghetto itself, you know, was it fenced off with a guard posts, that kind of thing?
Yes, I mean, there were, by that time, let me just think about this, over 4,000 flats in 290 blocks. And it's a small area. I would think there must have been about 60 to 70,000 of us in the ghetto, which is unimaginable. You know, when you tell somebody this, by the way, all non-Jews were moved out, so it was purely us. And what happened was that there were very few gates. They surrounded it by walls where there were no blocks of flats already, acting as a border. And they were all guarded by the Arrow Cross Party, and they had great fun killing or shooting anybody who happens to be on the street or happened to try to get out. They wouldn't allow any of us to go out. So we lived in this ghetto completely isolated until we started hearing shots and bombs falling. Because what was happening, the Russian army was approaching Hungary. They arrived first to other countries like Romania, and they started approaching Hungarian border. They came into Hungary, and in fact, their air force started bombing Budapest. Now, it's strange that here we were in the ghetto, and yet we had to hide in the basement because the Russians started bombing Budapest. At one time, in fact, our block was bombed, and we were very lucky not to be killed or the rubble not falling on top of us. So not only were we in the ghetto, we had to now hide from the Russians who were starting to arrive and bomb Budapest.
And you remember sheltering?
And I remember sheltering, going down into the basement, and it was a very strange way of living. Not only have we been incarcerated into these blocks of flats, but we're now hiding from the Russians arriving. It's very difficult for anybody to understand that, really.
I'm thinking also that you were saying your life growing up was, very much in the Jewish community, and with, little contact with non-Jews, and then almost, other than the one gentleman that effectively rescued
saved
you
my life.
Yes, the predominant interaction with non-Jews was with members of the Arrow Cross.
Oh yes, but they were the far-right Nazi party who have started the movement in Hungary much earlier. Just like Hitler, he started earlier in Austria, and it only developed into this Nazi party in the late 30s, early 40s. So yes, the Hungarian Arrow Cross Party was more Nazi than the Nazis, if you like, and they were much worse. They were much nastier than even the Germans.
And what do you know about how you survived in the ghetto?
I think what the kindness of the Nazis, that we were allowed to have bread and dripping and some water, which was brought up, we had hardly any food. So obviously we have become very thin. We were starving effectively. Maybe in comparison, it couldn't have been as bad as in the concentration camps, which I now figured out later on. But still, we were starving, and still people were dying. As I said, there were about 80 people every day dying on the streets. Dead bodies were lying on the street outside our block of flats from typhus, tuberculosis, or simply from hunger. And that went on until January, early January. It was the 17th of January, in fact, which is a date I shall always remember, only because I researched it afterwards, that the Russians arrived and freed us from the ghetto. What's important here, that the ghetto was mined. It was mined to be blown up by the Germans as they were retreating. But because the Russians came in very fast, the Germans did not have time to blow up the ghetto. And this was the second time my life was safe. First in the cupboard, and now in the ghetto, because it was not mined. And so we were free again. And so what happened was that my aunt and I came out, and we were in an alien country. Everything was bombed, destroyed, demolished, or on fire. We have no idea what's going on, where we are, or what to do. And that's when somehow we found out from a relative, and don't ask me who or how, that my father came out of the forced labor camp, as well as my uncle, who managed to escape. The two of them went to Romania somehow, and in a town called Oradea, in Hungarian, Nagyvárad, because that part of Romania used to belong to Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, so they still spoke Hungarian there. So they went there and they started a little shop, and they managed to start living a reasonable life. So my aunt found out, and we followed them to Romania, and at last then I had the chance to start living a relatively reasonable life and went to school there.
Before that, in Russia, in Budapest, after you were liberated, do you remember any interactions with the Soviet sort of soldiers or administration there?
No, but I know that while everybody welcomed the Russians, they turned out to be a very difficult. It turned out to be a very difficult period of time. They were not the nicest people to have as freedom fighters. They looted and raped, and they were not really interested in the people. They only interested in occupying the country. And in fact, it's interesting that the Russians who many of them came from the Caucasus area of Russia, who never even spoke anything other than their own language, and they had no idea where they were. They simply followed orders. So the answer is no, it wasn't a very happy situation. And in a way, it was very nice that we could go to Romania for that period of time. So there we lived in Romania, and we thought that my mother died in the concentration camp.
And how long were you in Aradia Najvarad for?
Let me just try to think. It's very difficult. I need to look at my papers here.
That's fine. But you would have gone there sometime summer 45? You would have headed?
No, earlier.
Earlier.
During this time, my mother was in the concentration camp in Mauthausen, which was one of the major concentration camps in Austria. And she was beaten, and her hair fell out, her teeth fell out, her back was broken. But when the Americans eventually freed her, she was one of the very few miraculously surviving, only 5,000 of them out of the hundreds of 110,000 who died in the camp. How she survived, it's a miracle we never found out. But when she came out, she was looked after by the Americans, who took her to a hospital. They looked after her, they made her recover, both physically and mentally. And only in spring 1945 was she strong enough to go back to Budapest to find out what happened. And she found that there's no trace of us. So she had no idea what happened to us. And it was only by some chance that she found, whether it was a relative or a friend, I don't know, who told her that we're in Romania. So she had no choice but to follow us there. By the way, just going back to the camp, my mother never talked about it. And I'm always very sad that I could not find out more about her, how she survived, because after all, what she has had there is a life which is unbearable. She survived by eating snails if she found any. She had no way of surviving. So how she managed to survive, I never found out. Anyway, going back, she then decided to follow us in Romania. And she suddenly appeared at the doorstep in Hungary, which was like a miracle, and it's a wonderful thing to have happened. However, it turned out to be a very strange step, because by that time, my father started going out with a local woman, Hungarian-speaking woman, because we all thought that my mother didn't survive. So when my mother saw what was happening, she decided that she cannot stay there. She took me away. We went back to Budapest and started a new life.
Do you remember the moment she came back?
Yes, I remember that she turned up. Obviously, she looked terrible, even though she has recuperated by then to an extent. And I mean, it was a miracle. It was very difficult to explain it, because there was my mother, who I thought was dead. How did she get back? How did she manage to find us? And what is she going to happen? What is she going to do with us? So I remember that she decided that this cannot go on. She cannot live with my father, because obviously he wanted to marry this other woman. So she took me back to Budapest. She divorced my father. She found a very small one-bedroom flat, and then I went back to school. So it's another new chapter in my life, if you like.
And your Aunt Ibi, where was she?
She also was in Budapest, and she then started to live her own separate life in Budapest.
Should we take a break there?
Oh, I think that would be a very good idea. Is it all right so far? Do you think I'm covering all right?
Before we took a break, we'd reached the end of the war, but you wanted to say something about your mother and what happened to her after she was taken from Budapest.
That's right, because we mentioned Mauthausen, the concentration camp, and we mentioned when she was taken from the Yellow Star House, but I later found out that that was on the 13th of October 1944, that she was taken and marched about 30 kilometers, sleeping on the roadside in snow and ice. They were building fortifications and so on, and obviously many died on the way. And it was just an introduction to what was still to come when they arrived in Austria and then further on in Mauthausen. I think it's important to remember that, because apart from the fact that they were treated so badly, obviously any jewelry, cash, even lighters were taken away, so they had nothing.
And is there anything else you know about her experience?
No, I know that she was marched to Mauthausen, and on the way they were sleeping on the roadside in the snow because it was a hard winter. And as I said, not just the problem of how to live, but how to find anything to eat, and how they managed to even get to Mauthausen is a surprise. It's unbelievable, because many died on the way. And imagine what came when they got to the camp. Anyway, that was something I think is important that we add to the story. Because the other problem is that she never talked about it. She never wanted to talk about it. And I always say, I wish I could have asked more questions, as many survivors are like that. They don't want to talk about what they have gone through. It's a great shame, because I would have wanted to know how she survived. How was she one of the 5,000 miraculous survivors? What happened in the camp? Did she do something there? Was she maybe working in a kitchen or something? How is it that 110,000 died and she was among the 5,000 who survived? I shall never know.
And what would happen when you used to ask her about things?
She just wouldn't talk about it. Maybe I should have pressed it, but her mental condition has never got to the stage when she was freely able to talk about this. She found it very difficult. She was not an easy woman to live with as a result of what she went through, unfortunately. But she lived a long life, and she was in her 90s when she died. So we were talking about, I think, that the Russians have arrived in Budapest in the 1945.
So you talked about how you'd gone to Oradea and come back with your mother.
That's right. And then we had to live under the Russian regime, which is, after all, was a people's democratic regime, which in fact was a communist government. And it was not the prime minister who was running the country, but the communist, which made a big difference, because everything, including the newspapers and the radio, was controlled by the press, by the government. And if they overheard you talking about anything anti-government, you disappeared and were never heard of again. So it was very much a dictatorship in many ways. And for example, in school, we thought we had a free life, but no, we were spied upon by teachers, and we were reported upon if we said anything anti-communist or anti-government. So we had to be very careful what to say. In fact, every year we had to march with the government to demonstrate our solidarity with the communists. and live under this kind of regime.
And did you and other children sort of do this happily? Did you talk amongst yourselves quietly? How did it?
Well, by that time I was in the college, which was the Railway and Road Technical College. And the only reason I was in that school, by the way, because we knew one of the teachers. I could not have gone to university because I was middle class and I was Jewish. Still, strangely enough, not a very happy situation under the Russians. So because we knew one of the teachers in this school, which is not what I wanted to do, I ended up in this railway college. And we had about 20 people, 20 kids in the class, out of which there were 4 Jews. And we obviously kept together. And we had to be very careful even there what to say and how to express our views, because we now realized that there were some kids who were not necessarily happy to talk to us and would report us to the teacher, who then reported us further. So it wasn't very comfortable. And as it happens, this was a 2-year course. And
what age would you have been?
I was between 16 to 18, something like that.
So that was the first education you'd had since before the war? Or was there something else in between?
No, I went to school locally beforehand. In fact, I should have mentioned that. And very strangely, when I was 14 years old, before the Railway Technical College, I was, and I attended the Boy Scouts equivalent in Hungary, and I became one of the leaders of the Boy Scouts. So that means that I must have had some leadership in me, that I was able to do that. And funnily enough, in the same school, I was asked to join as a postman the famous Hungarian Pioneer Railway in the mountains, steam railway, which was run entirely by children, apart from the driver. And I had a very happy few months there as a postman, which was liberty away from all the terrible things which were going on under the communist regime. But that was before I went to the Railway Technical College.
And tell us more about the college and your experience with the other Jewish students there.
Well, the college was very good because it taught us a totally different discipline. We went on tours on railway projects, and we somehow managed to live a very happy life in school. But just to give you an example of what we did when we were not in school, we didn't have much money. There was hardly any money, and it was not an easy life. And for example, we didn't have fridges and washing machines. So ice had to be brought from the market and taken upstairs into the ice box in the kitchen. Wood had to be brought in to our cellar and brought upstairs when we needed it. So it was a very hands-on, basic way of living. Food was not good. We ate a very unhealthy food. It was an unhealthy life. But we still lived reasonably well, and we went to concerts, we went to the opera house, and because it was very cheap, so we could do that. But one way of making money was that at night we reported to the road clearing department, and we swept the roads, or in the winter we cleared the ice on the bridges. And that was one way of making a bit of pocket money. In fact, after the when I finished the school, for a few months I worked as a worker's assistant in an iron factory near the Danube, which is when I picked up a terrible chilblain in my hands, and which is still with me. By the way, when I finished that school, I was then sent to because this college was part of the railways, I was sent out to the railways to measure the tracks just outside Budapest, which was a very boring, silly job, but it again kept me happy, and it meant that I made some money. But I had to join the Railway Workers' Union because that was part of the deal. And that way they could control what I was doing, and I had to make sure that I don't do anything silly.
Can I ask, in post-war Budapest, and with the coming of the People's Democratic Republic, was there any, if not public discussion, sort of discussion between yourselves and perhaps people that you met in school or at workplaces about what had happened to the Jews of Budapest during the war? Or was that topic off limits?
It was totally off limit. As I said, very few of my friends were Jewish, and we never discussed religion as such. It was not a good idea. But in any case, we lived our life without considering religion. It was most of Hungarians are Catholic, and so they obviously are not interested in what happened to us. And no, we didn't discuss anything to do with Jews.
Were there any resentments, or incidents of anti-Semitism, either personally or on a bigger scale?
I mean, Hungary has always been known for being anti-Semitic. The Hungarian Jews have always had a bad time, going way back hundreds of years, not just the recent history. It was known fact that the Hungarian Jews were not the same as the rest of the country. And so even when we thought we live a reasonably happy life in the 1930s, there was still anti-Semitism. And you could feel that quite often, even in the 50s. You knew that anti-Semitism is still not ripe, but covert, if not overt.
And did anything happen to you personally?
No, I have never been attacked in the 50s. I can't remember anybody abusing me. I did have a Jewish teacher at the college who sometimes told me that I need to be careful what I say.
And growing up as a boy and a teenager and a young man, would you have been considered looking Jewish? Did you look Jewish identifiably to people, or less so? And
well, at that time, I don't think I thought like that. But I suppose I was somebody who looked Jewish, and whether I was abused, I would not know. I really can't remember that I was directly abused, but there must have been people who looked at me and said, we don't want to deal with that guy because he's Jewish. So that probably was around. But if there was, I can't remember.
And it's maybe a esoteric question to ask, but what was it like to adjust from these kind of awful period in 1944 to 45? Do you remember any sense of adjustment to so-called normal life?
Yes, living under the Russians, we had inverted comma freedom. So we were not persecuted as such. We were not killed for being Jewish. So yes, we could go to the cinema, we could go to the theater, we go to the opera. We lived a reasonable social life. So yes, you could tell the difference, but it still wasn't a totally free life. And then, of course, this went on until October 1956.
And tell us about that.
Well, by October 1956, it was known that the students are not happy. We weren't happy, but we didn't do much about it at that time. But it soon became clear that the majority of students were not happy with what was going on, the repression, the control, and the Hungarian students had enough. And they have decided that it's time to do something about it. So a huge number of students got together and they marched to the Hungarian railways, demanding. They put together a 16-point plan which they presented to the radio to say that they want independent Hungary and free elections, among the other 16 points, and that they asked for it to be broadcast. Now you can imagine this was a big no-no as far as the Russians are concerned. And then the students, realizing that there's not much happened as a result of this, they started marching in Budapest, and that was the basis of the Hungarian Revolution.
And you were 19 at that point?
Yes.
Would you have been considered one of the students?
I was one of the students, but I did not march. I did not go out. In fact, in a way, I was afraid of what was going on. And the only time when I decided to go out and demonstrate was on the 25th of October, when a large number of people gathered outside the Parliament building to demonstrate and to ask the government, and the government was that time run by Imre Nagy, the Prime Minister, to come out and talk to the crowds. 200,000 people were gathered in the squares, a huge number of people. And they demanded answers to those 16 points. What they didn't know, that the Russians were placed on the rooftops around the square. And at that time, I heard one or two shots, and we lived very near the square, and I decided to go home. I just had a feeling. And when I got home, I heard many, many more shots. What happened was that the army or the Russians asked the crowds to disperse, and nobody moved. And they asked again, and nobody moved. So they started shooting. And they shot at the crowds. And by the end of the day, 300 dead bodies were lying on the square. And the next morning, you could still see blood and abandoned clothing on the square as a result of what happened the day before. And that was a warning to the Hungarians that the Russians are in charge and you better not demonstrate against them.
How did that feel to you at that time, given the things that you'd seen in your own life around 10 years before?
Well, what it meant that life like this couldn't continue much longer. What do? You are restricted in every way. You're surrounded by the army, the Russian army, as well as the left-wing communist Hungarian government. So clearly there was no life for me there anymore. So I had to take a huge decision. By that time, we heard that many Hungarians were escaping through Austria. And it was rumors, but the rumors got stronger and stronger, and we found out many people who disappeared. And a friend of mine with whom I was in school, called Peter, and I got together and said, well, what should we do? And we decided that we have no choice but to escape. Obviously, I told my mother, who said, if you go, I go. Now imagine that, in her case, to go into this unknown with me through something which she would not have experienced before, having gone through camps to do that. So I then decided to talk to my father, who by that time started life with his new family nearby. We had a very good relationship, but not on the phone, because that could have been overheard and we could have been arrested. And I spoke to my aunt Ibi as well and explained. And they all said, oh, you mustn't do that. It's not as bad as that. Surely things will get better here. To take a huge step of emigration, what you're going through, you never know what the life is like. Don't do it. And we had to fight this and decided, no, we will go. We will take that chance and we will escape. So what we have done is that my mother and I decided that we'll go. Now, my friend Peter had a relative living very near the train across the Danube, which was leaving towards the Austrian border on a regular system. And so we had to go across the Danube to be ready for the train next morning. And all we could do is take a bag of food and my teddy, which, by the way, I still have with me now, and which I had since I was 3 years old, and close the door and don't look back. What I need to mention here, that my aunt went to the flat after we left and collected our valuables and documents and photos, on which I based my book, which I wrote later, without which I couldn't have written the book. And eventually, which we can talk about later, she came out to England several times. We looked after her, and she brought out all these various documents and valuables, which we could then base the book on.
So you're at the Danube. Then what happens?
Well, next morning, what was the date of that? Let me just try to figure out what the date of that was, because I've forgotten.
Sometime November, December of 56.
I will figure out in a minute. I cannot remember what the date was. 21st of November it was.
Right.
So we got on the train, and because we worked on the railways, both Peter and I worked on the railways, we both had a ticket which was available free of charge on the trains. So the three of us went there. But first, we had to cross the river to get to this relative of his. Now, if we would have had more than a little bag of food, we would have been suspicious and we would have been stopped. And that is why we were able to get across. We slept the night there, and the next morning we boarded the train. We decided to get off at a station very near the border, where we found out that there were several others on the train who were doing the same, escaping from Hungary. And then we stood there, and we didn't know which way to go, because we've never been that way before. And there, very cleverly, were a few peasants who said, "We'll show you the road, but just give us some money, or your jewels, or your watch." And we had to do that. And they actually did take us towards, not the border, but the road going towards the border. And that was at night. We must have walked about, 20 miles in total towards the Austrian border. What we had to do is, this was at night, very cold winter, ice and snow. We had to climb over canals. We had to avoid mines. We had to avoid searchlights, tanks, because otherwise we would have been shot. And eventually we got to the border. Probably by that time, about 10 or 15 of us got together, and we had to cross the canal into Austria. And there was a watchtower there. And for the third time, my life was saved, because that watchtower was not manned. For miraculous reasons, it was not manned, and we were able to cross over the bridge into Austria, where there was a huge reception committee with lights so that we could find our way, and they gave us food and drink and allocated some stables for us to stay at and allowed us to stay the night.
Do you know roughly where the crossing point was?
Yes, at Andau, which is a very famous place. In fact, there has been a film on that as well. And it was a huge canal on the border of Austria and Hungary. And so next morning, we were told to board the buses, which would then take us to the next camp. And my mother was with me as well.
And she managed this journey?
How she managed it, it's a miracle. She had a strong personality, incredible personality, and incredible strength. And she said, "If you go, I go." And she came with us. But what happened was, which is a side story, there were lots of cars and lots of buses. And we said, when there was a queue of us, Peter and I told my mother, "You go ahead and we'll follow you." And when she got on the bus left, because they were full. We were left behind, and we took another bus. What we didn't know that she went to Vienna, and we went to Innsbruck in Upper Austria, by train eventually. So we went two different ways. You can imagine what she must have felt like. As it happens, she then went to Vienna, where she was helped by various organizations. She started working with the American Joint Organization, and she was trying to find us. But at that time, this new camp where we went in Solbad Hall near Innsbruck was not yet registered. So when we arrived at this camp, which was a disused army camp, we were looked after by the locals, who gave us second-hand clothing and food. We lived in barracks, about 40 of us in each barrack, in each floor, which was not pleasant, but is better than we had before. And we were staying there for some time. And her mother, in the meantime, was looking for us in Vienna. And eventually, she found out that this is a new camp. And she managed to obtain tickets, got to us in Innsbruck, found us, and asked if we want to go back with her. Amazing how she managed that. My friend Peter decided to stay behind. He's still there. He has had a very successful life on the railways, and he's now retired, and he's very happily living there. And I came back with my mother to Vienna, and we were allocated a small room in a house not far in the suburbs of Vienna, and we were looked after again by various organizations, and given food and vouchers to have something to eat. But again, we know that this had to change because you can't live like that as a refugee. Some people stayed behind, but we decided that this is not what we want to do. I spoke some English because for some strange reason, my mother got a tutor for me when I was little, and I learned basic English. It wasn't perfect English, but it was basic English. And so I decided that maybe I should try to find a country where I can speak English. And so I decided to queue outside the British Embassy and queued for several days and was fortunate to have one of the last few tickets or permits to come to England with my mother. And we were then given a couple of hours to get to the train, which was taking us to Ostend in Belgium, from where the boat was leaving. As you can see, I mean, things happen all the time, and it's very difficult to try to remember everything what happened to me, because so many things happened one after the other. And when we got to the ship, and I got on the ship, and that was the first time I saw the sea. I didn't realize what it's like. And the captain found out that I speak a little English, I don't know how, through the stewards. And I had to translate some orders for him through the loudspeaking system to the hundreds of Hungarians. What I said, I have no idea. Whether it made any sense, also no idea. But I did, and we got across from Ostend to Dover. And when we got to Dover, again, a welcoming committee, wonderful, got onto the train, and this time we were taken to another disused camp, this time an army camp, an Air Force camp in Cannock Chase.
Just up by Wolverhampton?
It was quite, yes. Mm-hmm. And we were then allocated barracks there, and because I said that I can speak a bit of English and can help with translation, my mother and I was given a separate little compartment to stay in. We didn't have to share with the rest of the Hungarians. And then every week, twice at 5 o'clock in the morning, I had to go to the railway station, collect the hundreds of Hungarians coming in, and show them around the camp, facilities, kitchen, whatever. And later, I had to live like that for a few weeks until I found out, because I was talking to the officers all the time, that there was a stately home near East Grinstead in Sussex, which took some Hungarians, and they were looking for some Hungarians who wanted to go there. Well, that was a godsend opportunity for me, because I knew that East Grinstead is not far from London.
And what was the name of that home?
Rowfant House in Rowfant, which is just outside East Grinstead, which at that time was run by a religious organization, and they maintained it. And we went there, and that was the first time that I could relax. And there was a lake, a forest, which is a wonderful way of trying to understand where I am, what I am, and start to look at the future, which I couldn't do so far. And because at that time there was a railway station just outside where we were, which has now been discontinued, I went to London 2 or 3 times a week. But you can imagine when you see London, a strange place, a huge place with lots of people. It was very strange and quite frightening, actually. And it took me some time to recover just by watching all this. Now, what did I do in London? Well, there was such an organization as the Hungarian Jewish Refugee Committee. And they looked after all Hungarian Jews coming to London. And without them, I don't think I could have survived, or I wouldn't have known what to do. They took us under their wing. They not just allocated a room for us in a Jewish family, in Cricklewood actually, in London, but also, just to show the generosity, they gave us pocket money. And I remember that one of them took me to Burton's to buy. Burton's was a department store, clothing, and bought me a suit because they said, if you go for interviews, you need a suit. And they bought lots of things, and that's how I started life in London.
The Hungarian sort of refugees that were coming to Cannock Chase and then to the Rowfund House, were they both Jewish and non-Jewish, I assume?
The Hungarian Refugee Committee was a Jewish refugee committee.
But the refugees before that were both Jews and non-Jews?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, there are thousands coming here at that time. So, no, there were lots of Hungarians who have lived ever since in London. It's interesting because a lot of Hungarians decided to go to Australia or New Zealand or America because they felt that they have a better future, a better chance of making something of their lives. My view was that I don't want to be outside Europe. I felt that I'm a European. I know it was too near Hungary, but I still felt that I'm happier being near Europe, and I could not imagine going all the way to the other end of the world, especially not with my mother, because I couldn't imagine for her undertaking a journey like that.
Were you able to maintain contact with family members back in Hungary?
No, not at that stage. Apart from letters which I have exchanged with my father, we were very close. In fact, talking about my father, I really didn't have a father most of my young life, which is something people don't understand. At one stage, I didn't have a mother either, only my aunt. So she acted as mother and father. So no, he and I were in constant touch. Unfortunately, he died age 55 of cancer in Budapest. So I really didn't have much of a chance to establish a better relationship with him.
And in London, you said that the Hungarian Jewish Refugee Committee placed you with a Jewish family.
That's right.
Was that a British Jewish family?
No, as it happens, they were, I think, Germans. But it was a very happy situation. And then what happened was that I had to decide, this was February 57. In fact, just now we are talking, it's February. So imagine how many years ago that was. Figure that one out.
I won't be able to in the moment. But.
So I had to decide what to do. And I had to decide, because I wasn't keen on being in the railway business. It wasn't me. I don't have a technical mind. I figured out that I like people. I want to be around people. So I have to take a huge decision. And I had to decide what to do. So I went to Hendon Technical College, which is now the Middlesex University, but in the catering college side. And I was there for 2 years, and between 1957 and 59, and I learned everything about the hotel business. Catering meaning kitchen, waiting, restaurant, reception, everything. And I obviously must have done well because the head of the class at the school suggested that I join one of the leading hotel companies in this country. And I did that, and that's how my life in the hotel business started.
Can you tell us how it developed?
Yes, well, I joined the class. I was the only foreigner. I was older than all my classmates. I had to learn the curriculum in English. So everything I did had to be translated in my head in nutrition, in maintenance, English, maths, physics. Imagine doing that in a language you are not fluent in. And that was very hard. But I persevered, and probably because of the way my aunt and mother was, I also persevered because I'm also, if you like, a strong personality, and I finished nearly top of the class. And that's why I was recommended to go into the hotel business, and because I passed my exams. So what happened? They recommended me to go into this college, and I graduated in 1959. And the principal thought, no, you'll be absolutely right for this, go there. So I did do, and I started work at the very bottom of the hotel business. And I mean, who would have thought that if I worked day and night at a starting salary of £9 a week, that I can survive? I could have easily fallen by the roadside by then. And that's where my life started, in the hotel business. And it took some time before I found my feet, if you like. And the other point is worth mentioning here, that after 5 years residency, in September 1962, I applied for English citizenship, which I have received. And that, of course, was a huge day in my life.
What did it mean to you?
It meant a huge amount. I was not stateless anymore. I was not homeless anymore. I now belonged for the first time. That really started me on a very positive way forward, if you like.
You mentioned that early on in your studies or in your hotel work,
That's right.
that you were translating things from Hungarian
Absolutely.
to English in your head. Do you remember a time when that stopped?
It never actually stopped. It's a funny thing. If you speak a different language, it stopped 90%. But I would still now and again count in Hungarian, for example. Odd words suddenly come to me. But I don't really speak Hungarian here because my wife never learned. Funnily enough, my son went back to Hungary to teach English. And he then stayed with my cousins. We didn't talk about my cousins. There are 2 cousins in Budapest who stayed there after the war. They stayed there under the Russians. They had a very sad life. They really haven't got very far. One of my cousins became a doctor and did reasonably well, comparatively speaking. And the other one had a menial job. They're still living there with a family. Anyway, so my son stayed there.
What were their names, the cousins' names?
They were both called Farago. Why? Because my uncle, Rudy, was Farago, which is my mother's maiden name. And he then married, as I said, in Romania. And so he's got the 2 children, one from his first marriage, one from his second marriage. Too complicated. But the main thing is that he has got 2 families. He did have 2 families. And my son went back and taught English to Hungarians and picked up a bit of Hungarian, which he still has fun telling me about. My daughter, on the other hand, strangely enough, went into the conference business and organized conferences in Budapest. And with her name, Haidu, people thought that she speaks Hungarian, which of course she didn't. And that was always a laugh when she explained that, unfortunately, apart from the 5 words of yes, no, and how are you, she didn't speak any Hungarian. So that's the background to that. I still speak the odd Hungarian because I meet Hungarians here. But one other interesting point here is that I have a Hungarian accent, obviously, maybe not a pronounced one, depending on how tired I am, but I have an English accent in Hungarian. And many people laugh when I speak Hungarian. I don't find the right words either, because the Hungarian language also progressed and I haven't kept up with it. So I don't read Hungarian, I don't listen to Hungarian. It's the last thing I want to do. But I have an accent.
Did you, I imagine there must be sort of Hungarian social clubs and things happening in London with the community here. Did you ever connect or do any of that?
No, I maintain and still maintain that the last thing I want to do is to have anything to do with Hungarians. I mean, what Hungary means to me is not nice. There's nothing, I have no memories why I would want to maintain anything to do with Hungary. And maybe we should mention here that after I received my nationality, my British nationality, it took me at least 10 years before I decided to go back to Hungary because I was afraid. And then I renounced my Hungarian citizenship, nationality, and that's when I went back, first on my own, to meet my cousins again, to look around and see, and still found it not very pleasant, boring, drab, buildings not in very good position, people are not very nice. Then later I took the family back to show them where I came from, the bullet holes in the square, the synagogue, the ghetto, the Yellow Star House. And
was that after the end of communism or still?
No, it's still communism in the 50s and 60s. And then I took my daughter back on her own, much later than the end of communism, and then my son on the 50th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution. And that gave me an idea, an opportunity to try to explain to them what I have gone through, because the next point was I had to write a book. I had to write a book for several reasons. One, I needed to write it for the family. Two, I had to write it because Hungary is a country few people talk about when it comes to the Holocaust. Everybody talks about Poland and Germany. And I thought that this book would help in understanding what went on in Hungary. But I also wrote the book because I felt this is a way of telling people what I have gone through and hoping that people will understand that this should not happen again. So anyway, we went back to Hungary and I was able to show them what I have gone through. And even years after that, they found it very difficult to understand where my life under the Nazis was, where my life under the Soviet regime was, and how I escaped. It was very difficult for people to understand. Even today, when I give talks to schools, it's very difficult for people to understand how my segments of life happened.
Why do you think that is?
It is very difficult because most people have gone through one traumatic period. Not many have gone through 3 traumatic periods. And not only that, but as you've heard, the problem I have is all the dates I have to remember because so many things happened to me in so many years and it's almost impossible to keep it in order. But to go back to where we were, which is the hotel business, what happened was that I started, as I said, £9 a week, and I started as a waiter, then I was a chef, and then I was a receptionist in a hotel, and then I ended up in the sales office. And that's really where I really felt at home. The sales office was where I felt I can do some good. And who would have thought that being in the sales office enabled me to blossom, if you like. I eventually became director of the director of sales, and I traveled overseas 160 times, in fact, to bring overseas tourists into this country. And that was my job, meeting tour operators, travel agents, airlines all over the world, and bring them here. I became chairman of the London Tourist Board. I became chairman of the Hotel Sales Managers Association. I received an award from the Tourist Board from the work I have done. And so I progressed in this new life.
And can you talk about meeting your wife?
Yes. Now, where was it? At that time, I was chairman of a local Jewish organization, youth organization. And we had regular meetings, outings, and parties. And one day I was invited, that was in 1970.
And this was in London?
And I was invited to a house in Highgate in London to come to a party by one of the girls whose parents owned the house. I didn't realize that another girl who stayed with her invited others to come to this party. And so I was invited by one girl, and my wife was invited by another girl. And it was one of those things which is a cliche, and you see it in films, but it was no question that we saw each other across the room, and that was it. And just to talk a little bit about this, it's quite strange and quite funny. We started talking, and it was quite clear that there was something there, and 1970. And so afterwards I said, well, can we just carry on talking? And she says, yes, would you like to come home to my parents, and let's carry on. Now, she borrowed her father's Jag, and I had a little Mini. So there I was following her Jag in my little Mini, saying to myself, my God, that won't get very far. And we got home and we started talking, and clearly we liked each other. And I said, well, let's carry on meeting. And she said, well, it's not so easy because I'm going back to Montreal, where I'm a registrar at the university, McGill, for another year. You can imagine how I felt about that. And I had to accept that. We then started writing letters because you couldn't phone at that time. It was very expensive. And it went on for a year. And she came back and we started chatting again in December. And she said, well, actually, I have to tell you, I'm going back for a second year. And we survived 2 years of not being together. Clearly, it was strong feelings. And when she came back the second year, after the second year, it was clear that we kind of meant for each other. And we then started the relationship and married in 1972.
And who were her parents?
That's another interesting story. And I sometimes refer to it when I talk to people. Her parents came from Berlin. He decided in the late 30s, he had the foresight that living in Germany, living in Berlin, he has no future. He could see that something is not right. So he emigrated first to Spain, which was a mistake because Franco was there, and then to London. And in London, with nothing, just like me, he started an engineering business with nothing in a little back shop somewhere. And eventually, he progressed into a factory where they started manufacturing centrifuges. And when he retired, he had a huge factory in Crawley. And when he sold the factory, he decided to put the money into a foundation, which is called the Fuchs Foundation, Foulkes. And that money is now has been used since for doctors who wanted to do research. There was no such thing. Nobody thought of this before. He had this foresight of funding this money for those every year who came and asked for help, and that is still going. They now have 700 fellows in all these years. My wife is running the foundation, and my daughter is now involved and will be the next generation taking it on. Many of the fellows are now leading professors in both as in science and in medicine, not just in this country, but all over the world. In fact, they have a branch in Israel as well. They support about 7 or 8 people every year with money to get them going. And this makes them, this really helps them in making a life in the business, in the medical business. So that was the story behind my wife's family. And so that really is the story of my life in the hotel business. And then when I retired from the hotel, from the large company I work with, I decided to become a consultant. And I started advising hoteliers, independent hoteliers who didn't know what to do and who wanted somebody who explained to them how to run a hotel, how to get business, day to day, and so on. And I did that for a long time until eventually I retired. And when I retired, my wife persuaded me that I should do something and not sit at home. And I applied to become a magistrate. And I was successful. I became a magistrate, and I did it for many years. I was on the bench for both youth, adult, and licensing courts, which I did, as I say, for nearly 20 years. And I only retired from that some years ago.
Quick question. In terms of your career both in the hotel industry and then as a consultant and then as a magistrate, are there any kind of particular high points that come to your mind about things that you did?
Well, in the hotel business, being chairman of the Hotel Industry Marketing Group, being chairman of the British London Tourist Board, it made me feel that I'm achieving something and I'm giving something back. Because all the time after that period, when I became a magistrate, that was always in the back of my mind. I'm giving back something to thank the country for what they have done to me. The fact that I am here, that I'm in a reasonably happy situation and that I have achieved so much, I couldn't have done without the support I received when I arrived in this country. So yes, that's always in my mind.
And just picking up on something else you mentioned earlier, that you met your wife because you were part of a Jewish organization. I'm wondering if you could talk about your connection with Jewish life in London since you've been here.
After many years running this Jewish society,
which was called what?
The Charter Society, because it was formed at a junction of North London called Charter Square or something like that. And most of us were from that area, and that's how it started. We organized events, outings, and so on. But when that eventually folded, we got married in a synagogue, in the Upper Berkeley Street Synagogue, which is a beautiful, one of the biggest synagogues in the world. In fact, the second biggest, I think, after the New York one. Then when my daughter got married, they married there, and her baby was there as well. Apart from that, we don't live an active Jewish life. I always, when I give talks to schools, and we can talk about that later, I always say that to me the most important thing is to be a good human being. And obviously a good Jew, but we are not observant. We don't go to synagogue every Friday, but obviously we know what goes on around the world. We believe in our religion, and we hope that we are good Jews. Just because we don't go to a synagogue, we must still be good Jews. And that's the attitude we pass on to our children.
Growing up in Britain, have there been any experiences of anti-Semitism here?
Yes, there have been. Let me just go back. What I didn't say is that when I finished with my magistracy, I became involved with the local police. And I then started running the local Safer Neighborhood panel. I was chair of that for many years. And I also got involved with the borough police. And I became the first independent chair of their organization, where I was responsible to talk to superintendents and various high-ranking officers to explain to them what's going on in the borough. And I was given various certificates and various other things for being in charge. In fact, I'm just going to tell you, I got to read that. In 2019, I got a commendation for commitment and professionalism presented by the borough commander. And of course, it made me feel that it was worthwhile doing. But going back to the anti-Semitism, I was running a group of people in Haringey, which is the borough I live in, which is one of the largest boroughs in this country, or certainly in London, of all denominations round the table to give voice to the people of the borough. And there sometimes you could pick up odd comments, but I ignored that and just got on, because my job was to unite everybody and to report to the superintendents, the borough commanders, on views of what people think in the borough. So while there may have been some anti-Semitism, I tried to ignore that. But talking about anti-Semitism, until what happened in October, over 1,000 incidents of anti-Semitism takes place in this country. Obviously, much more now. But when I give talks, I always say, look, it's not just this country. Unfortunately, this happens in Germany, in France, and almost any other European countries. Anti-Semitism is ripe, and that's why I give talks to fight that.
And let's say before October the 7th, what do you attribute this anti-Semitism to? Let's just say in Britain.
It's an inherent situation. It started hundreds of years ago. It's not a new thing. Anti-Semitism has been ripe in this country way back in the 1500s, 1600s. And it's just, I mean, the Jews were the moneylenders at many occasions, and that immediately caused problems. So it's nothing new. Unfortunately, it's not changed much, changed the way it is. But anti-Semitism has been ripe in this country for hundreds of years, unfortunately.
And do you see sort of increases and dips, or has it been a steady rise? Or
no, it's a definite rise. There's no question about it. And that's why when you go outside, you see security outside Jewish schools permanently before the Gaza incident. And and synagogues got security outside there. And that will not stop. It's very sad, but it won't stop. So maybe the other point I would just like to make is that I should say that in the let's talk about this teaching. I work with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which is this emblem here, and the Holocaust Educational Trust. As a survivor, those of us who work with them, it's not many of us, about 30 or 40 of us, who go around to schools, to various organizations, to talk about our experiences. And I always say to them, look, I'm here as a living history, telling you what happened to me. And the reason we go out is because we want people to go home and to think about what they've just heard, and to talk about it among their families, among their friends. Because a lot of people in schools in particular come from different backgrounds, many from countries like in Asia and Africa where there are problems, and maybe to pass the message on that the more people understand what we have gone through, maybe they will fight similar situations around the world. And it's maybe just worth mentioning that in 2020, I was appointed by Her late Majesty the Queen with the award of the MBE for services to Holocaust education and commemoration. And I received that from Princess Anne in Windsor Castle. And that is a wonderful recognition of what we do. And it does urge you to carry on doing this work as long as possible.
And can you talk a little bit about what you actually do when you say this work? What kind of things does that mean?
Right. Well, I have prepared a text which is about 40 minutes long with slides from my book showing my life, starting from when I was 3 years old right until I got married and I received my MBE. As I talk to maybe 100, 200 kids at a time. I notice that they watch this mesmerized. They cannot understand that there's a man here who have been through all this, and they listen very intently, and the questions afterwards are fascinating and very rewarding because they ask questions probably I wouldn't have thought of. And they ask about my life, which I didn't include in my talk. And by answering these questions, I help them to understand what I've gone through. And I keep finishing every time. Please try to understand. We are here to make sure that this should not happen again. And it works, I hope.
And are there some thought-provoking questions that you can remember that they've asked you?
Well, they obviously ask me about my religion, about my family, about my father, about my mother in the camp, about my children. So all the questions which I obviously have the right answer for, but some of the questions are very difficult to answer because I'm not a politician and I do not want to get involved in any questions relating to politics. And I like to stick to my own history.
And the work with schools was with the Holocaust Educational Trust?
For both the Holocaust Education. The Holocaust Educational Trust sends me out to schools. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust sends me out mainly to adults. For example, yesterday I was at the Foreign Office. I was talking last week. I was asked to go to Cardiff, and I gave a talk in front of the Welsh Assembly, with the First Minister being there, who then thanked me afterwards. I gave a talk to a company who, it was a hybrid event with 600 people watching me from around the world. So it's a very rewarding and very tiring way of living. And this is the period, because 27th of January is the anniversary of the Holocaust Memorial Day. And last week, this week, and next week, I'm giving talks almost every second day. A very nice incident is that I give a talk to in a local synagogue, but not as you would expect to Jews. They bring in students from local Catholic and Muslim schools. So I have in front of me 100 Muslims or 100 Catholics, because that's a very clever way of showing that religion shouldn't be a divider. And it works. And they take you into the synagogue and they open the whole back of the synagogue and show them the Torah and everything and explain how they practice their religion.
And are there particular kind of, I don't know, tropes or stereotypes that the audiences you speak to come up with and that you have to address, do you find?
No, I don't find that there are any particular type of people. It's wonderful to be able to give talks to so many different kind of people. And one of the things which I always find bring tears to people's eyes is when I show them my teddy, which I have with me here, and which, as I said, I had with me since I was 3 years old. I have a slide of it, which I show, and then I bring it out. And there's always around the room, the room where I give talks. And that again brings home to them where I have been, because the teddy has been with me through all that misery, if you like. And that helps in understanding.
And you mentioned to me earlier about the work with the Imperial War Museum.
Now that's a very interesting story. When I wrote my book, I started it in 2012 and I finished it in 2015. It's not published for sale. It's on the web, available free of charge. It's called My Life in Two Countries. And I just had 20 odd copies printed. I took it to various organizations, to the Wiener Library, to the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, Holocaust Educational Trust, various other organizations, including the Imperial War Museum, who at that time were thinking of redoing their Holocaust galleries, which were very old-fashioned, and they're going to rebuild the whole thing. And when I gave it to them, the man in charge of the whole new development said, "This is interesting, come and talk to us." So I went there, and he says, "Well, look, this is an interesting book. We are very keen for you to come and work with us because we have a box of Hungarian bits and pieces, and we have no idea what this says. Would you mind translating?" So I took not all of it, some of it home, and translated quite a lot of it. And eventually, we ended up with just 2 postcards, which are now exhibited in the new Holocaust galleries, immediately under the wagon, which was the kind of wagon which was used to take people to the camp. And the one particular postcard I read was by a mother who was clearly in one of the wagons, and she was writing to her son saying, "I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what my future is. But if I don't see you again, I wish you a very good life. Such words. And then she must have put this card through the wagon wall. Somebody must have found this postcard, who then must have posted it to the Sun. And somehow this postcard ended up in the Imperial War Museum. And that is now exhibited in the exhibition with my translation. The other important point is that I asked the museum to please have a Hungarian section, which had never been there. And I thought it's vital, as I said earlier, not just Polish and German background, but let's have a section for the Hungarians. And now under the wagon, there is a whole shelf with my photo, my mother's photo, my father's photo somewhere else, explaining a little bit about me and my background. And I'm very pleased that that happened because I took my family there. And that's a nice reminder of what I have achieved.
I want to ask a few broader questions before we move on to the photographs and other things. Do you think your experiences as a child surviving the Holocaust have impacted your outlook on the world?
I think my whole life impacted my outlook on the world. I can't separate bit by bit which bit helped me or hindered me or affected me more or less. Overall, it made me a stronger man, maybe a better man. It made me achieve more. It made me fight for my rights within my business and within my life. It made me inquire more. And it made me question everything and not just accept everything. And that is the attitude which my wife shares with me and which hopefully will be passed on to our children.
Do you see parallels, or do you draw parallels between the treatment of Jews, let's say in German-occupied Hungary, and the experiences and treatment of other groups in other places?
That's very interesting, because the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and the Holocaust Educational Trust make sure that it's known that apart from the Holocaust against the Jews, there was a Holocaust against the travelers, gypsies, as well the other Holocausts in Rwanda, Darfur, and Srebrenica. So we always make a point of mentioning that because they suffered a hell of a lot more than many other countries, and they have gone through in many ways, similar terrible situations like we have.
And watching the news in the last couple of years, how does it feel as somebody who's both a Holocaust survivor and having gone through the experience under the Russian rule in Hungary?
Well, maybe to sidetrack here, people often ask me whether I read a certain book about the Holocaust, whether I watched a film about the Holocaust, whether I'm interested. And I always say, on television, I say I cannot watch or read anything to do with the Holocaust. But when I give a talk and we come to the square on which 300 bodies lay after the 200,000 people gathered, and I show the bodies and I show the tanks, I say to them, stop for a minute, watch the news. And this is exactly what's going on in the Ukraine by the same Russians who did it to us in 1956. And then I carry on. So I'm trying to bring a parallel to what happened to me as what happens in the Ukraine.
And obviously there's been the October 7th attack, and also televised, and anything you'd like to say?
I don't particularly want to get involved in that particular discussion, obviously, because I'm not a historian and I'm not a politician. I think the only 2 points I want to make, that anti-Semitism shot right up, but so has anti-Muslim feelings. So whichever way you look at it, it's a terrible thing to happen. and one only hopes that this situation gets solved and that the people who have been abducted will be freed.
Can you see any sort of, maybe it's too difficult to say now, but any sort of places for optimism or ways that you would hope things could be?
I think one thing which happened in my life is to look forward and to look for optimism. My whole life you have to look forward and you try to be as optimistic as possible, whatever the situation, because you've gone through lots of things where you couldn't see the future. When, for example, I escaped. So you've got to be optimistic. And I can only answer that question to say you have to be optimistic. You have to believe that there'll be a solution, and you have to believe that there won't be much more bloodshed.
And for you today, what significance is there, if any, about sharing your testimony on camera to us?
Well, as I mentioned to you, I have been interviewed by various organizations, various broadcasting companies. In fact, just as an aside, last year I was involved with BBC Radio, and that was on the 27th of January. And what they did, they syndicated me. They shoved me out to 15 radio stations, and I had to talk to 5 minutes, one after the other, to 15 radio stations. And that was very tiring, but very satisfying. Here I was telling my story, or in a few minutes, about my life, about the optimism. What a wonderful way of talking to people. So the more people I talk to, the happier I am. I don't care how many interviews I give. I don't care how long it takes. I think it's vital, and I love doing it because it has results.
Do you have any message for future generations of people who will be watching this interview?
Well, it's very difficult to summarize a message. You have had various messages from me right through the whole thing. I think probably to say, learn, understand, and pass on the message, and be optimistic, as you just said.
Thank you. Let's take a quick break and do the photographs. Okay. Thank you.
Blimey, getting on.
John, can you tell us about the photos we're looking at?
Yes, this is my book, which is titled Life in Two Countries, which I wrote in 2015. And what you're looking at is my father on the left, my mother, and then on the second page, my four grandparents. Sorry.
And of the grandparents, which of them do you have memories of?
I have memories of my grandfather. Can I do it again?
No, keep going. It's fine.
I have memories of my grandfather on the bottom of the page, who stayed with us and who died in the Yellow Star House.
Thank you.
That wasn't very good.
John, please tell us who's in these photographs.
This again are photos from my book. The photo on the left is me 1 year old. The second photo is me 2 years old. And on the other side is the Jewish primary school when I was 7 years old. And you see me on the top left of the photo.
Did the school have a name at all?
No, Jewish primary school.
And are there any names of other children there or teachers that you remember?
I remember one particular girl who I was in touch with much later, and she was the only one of the whole class I can pinpoint.
And what was her name?
Eva Geiger.
Was that her maiden name or married name?
Maiden name.
Thank you. Sorry, I hope you cut that before I put my hands in. And John, tell us about what we're looking at here.
You are looking at the book had a life in two countries, which I wrote in 2012 and published in 2015. It is available on the web free of charge, and I always make sure that when I talk to organizations that they should go onto the web and learn about my life through this book, and it is also available at various institutions.
Thank you. And please tell us who is in this photograph.
Right, this is the family photo which was taken quite recently, and looking from left to right you see my son, then me, then my daughter, then my wife, then my daughter's husband, and on the bottom you see our 4 grandchildren.
And when and where was this photo taken?
That was taken here in our garden.
And roughly when?
About 2 years ago.
Thank you.
You want to do those two?
Yeah. And what are we looking at here?
Well, I'm very proud to be able to say that I was recognized by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth with the award of MBE in the 2020 New Year's Honours for services to Holocaust education and commemoration, and received it from Princess Anne at Windsor Castle.
And can you tell us anything about the day when you received it?
Yes, it was a day obviously I shall not forget. I was very happy to have my wife with me at the time, to walk through the rooms of Windsor Castle and to be presented by Princess Anne is an honour which is memorable.
Thank you. Wonderful. And John, please can you tell us who we're looking at now?
Well, we are looking at my teddy, which I have since I have been 3 years old, and he has gone through exactly what I have gone through under the Nazi occupation, the Russian occupation, and through my escape from Hungary to England and during my life in this country. He sits on my desk and reminds me of what I have gone through.
And do you remember who gave him to you?
It was my family. I think it must have been either my mother or my father.
And does he or she even, have a name in Hungarian?
No, we decided not to name it anything. We just call it the teddy.
And how does that sound in Hungarian?
I'm really not absolutely sure, because teddy was used just as much in Hungarian.
And before we finish the interview today, are there any sort of final thoughts or anything you haven't had the chance to say that you'd like to?
Yes, I would simply say that I am very happy that we have had this opportunity to put all my thoughts in such a very simple way to all those people who will be looking at it or listen to it later on, because after all, I am living history, and who knows how often or how much longer I'm able to do this.
And on behalf of myself and the Shoah Foundation, the USC Shoah Foundation, just like to say thank you very, very much for giving us the interview today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.